So now let's talk about security appliances. So this is a wide area, but again, a simple area to understand basically. But there's a few key points I'm going to go through that I want to make sure that you're aware of. So when it comes to appliances, we want to understand the different types that are out there. So we'll talk about firewalls, we'll talk about endpoints, we'll talk about other facets of intrusion detection appliances, intrusion prevention, for example. Again, nothing spectacularly difficult. We'll also talk about other areas around anti-malware and other appliances as well. So one of the areas on the exam will require you to at least understand the basics of a firewall. Now, again, you don't need to, configure firewalls for a living to pass this section. A lot of it is just knowing the difference, like between the types of firewalls. So for example, you have a perimeter, LAN segment, host application, etc. Now, let's define a firewall first before we talk about the different types. Now, just for those folks that don't know exactly what a firewall is, that is listening, just realize that typically a firewall, the basic function of a firewall is traffic filtering. And generally, the firewall is going to process traffic according to rules or rule sets. So again, just keep that at a high level. That's really the main thing we want you to know. Now, the different types of firewalls are going to be based on, the type of traffic that it's, going to filter. So again, just realize that there's different types of firewalls, and depending on the type of traffic, usually that's where the name comes from, or the type. Now, another thing about like firewalls, for example, excuse me, is that generally a firewall, you're going to set up rules. So one of the things too, when you set up a firewall, is generally you're going to want to use what is called, typically when it comes to like a privilege or a rule, it's going to be called the least access. So you may want to write that down. I don't believe that's in the slide set, but again, least access is something you may want to know. Now, this is the same privilege as least privilege, of course. So least access, least privilege, common sense, right? You don't want to open up your firewall and give more access than you need, right? Nothing particularly difficult to understand. Okay, so rule sets are called tuples, and an implicit deny is usually a drop or reject. Now, on this exam, you'll likely get a question on a firewall. What are the terminologies around a firewall? So do you understand what those are? And then there's another term I want to make sure that you're aware of, and that is called firewalking. Now, if you're let's say you're the adversary, one of the things that you want to do is try to bypass the firewall. Now, generally, the way you do that is called basically firewalking. That's the term. So basically, firewalking is essentially a way to determine a firewall's ACL and mapping, and also too, firewalking could also be used, for a router or a switch as well. So the attacker is going to discover what ports are open. So basically, he's going to scan all the ports, and he sees, well, SNMP is open, or he sees DNS, or he sees some of the SQL ports or whatever. Then again, that's great. Let's say the hacker is trying to determine, what UDP ports are open, or what ICMP ports are open. What are the protocols that are being allowed through those ports? So port 5355, or 4443, or 4445, whatever. So again, the goal is try to figure out what's open, and then whatever's open, they're going to try to exploit. That's really simply put what you want to know. Now, firewalking typically too can be mitigated with what is called network address translation, NAT. Now, this is where typically if you're going to traverse the internet, you want to set up NAT. That's typically the address space behind the router. So typically it's going to block those outgoing status messages, for example. So when we talk about logging, right, no different than anything else. You want to log everything coming in and everything coming out. Again, common sense. Now the question is what do you log and for how long? Now, one of the typical strategies with logging you want to do is generally determine your log retention strategy and schedule. Now, again, every organization is going to have different requirements. You need to identify what you really need to log and what you don't, where perhaps do you need to log traffic going out for months, or do you need to log traffic for web proxies, or do you log traffic for every firewall port or whatever? Again, I mean, typically when it comes to logging, the more the better, but I know that resources are typically challenged in a lot of organizations, so it's really hard. So whether you log ingress or egress or UDP or not, that's up to you to determine. So again, try to determine what makes sense. So again, this is again something that typically comes up quite a bit. I'll be honest. There just isn't enough resources to log everything you want, so you got to be strict with your logging. And then proxies, right? You have proxies, and again, for those folks that aren't familiar with a proxy is what? Proxy server generally, and actually too in the industry, a lot of the appliances that are out there can act as a proxy and a firewall. So a lot of confusion over what they are, but generally a proxy is going to be more protocol specific for typically outbound traffic. So like, surfing the web uses HTTP or HTTPS. Those are very common proxies. Again, there's other types of proxies. For example, we'll talk about reverse here in a second, but just realize the main benefit of a proxy is generally that when, for example, you're surfing the internet, you're going to be within a perimeter network, and part of that is going to enable for hopefully a good degree of like traffic management typically. So, and these are some of the benefits of an outbound proxy. And then you have typically an inbound reverse proxy. So again, same approach as an outbound, but again, it's typically going to publish content versus like someone surfing for content typically. And then firewall vendors. Now, on the exam, they're going to ask you about what vendors provide firewalls. You'll need to have an idea of what some of these folks are. So again, and I do cover some of these as well in the short demos or the show and tells that I go through. So again, these are some of the popular ones, Palo Alto, Checkpoint, plenty of others like Fortinet. The list is pretty endless. And then we have network intrusion detection systems. This is more of an analysis. So basically it's monitoring the traffic and trying to pick up behavior, patterns, anomalies, etc. We'll talk about that as well. Now we have sensor placement. So typically with intrusion detection, for example, again, for those folks that aren't familiar with intrusion detection systems, typically you're using software tools and they're going to be more real-time analysis. So just remember that these are typically real-time analysis tools that you're using, and it's literally, watching the traffic flows, and it's trying to pick up behaviors and other patterns that it's looking for. So when we have like a NIDS, for example, what it's doing is basically a packet sniffer, and what a packet sniffer is it's picking up those packets and basically analyzing them. So it's actually looking through the packets, trying to identify traffic that could be malicious, basically. And again, you could use the console to view all this and to filter whatever you want to do. Now, generally, too, you want to have sensors. Now, a sensor is simply nothing more than basically an agent, I like to sort of compare it to. And you're going to place that typically in a firewall or close to, something that's important to your organization. It could be a switch as well, a file server, whatever. And again, you're going to monitor the traffic to it. Now, generally, too, there's a term that's also similar to this that's used in the networking world called port mirroring. You could also set up port mirroring to monitor traffic. You could use passive detection and alerting and active response as well. Now, passive detection, again, is exactly what it sounds. It's more of a, well, we're just going to monitor. We're not going to do too much, but we'll let you know. So basically, when it comes to passive detection, this is more displaying alerts, really. It's not going to react to it. Now, active is different. That's where it actually is going to drop the connection or run a script. So again, just for the test here, I want to make sure you get the difference. So passive is more, it's going to let you know, but it's not going to try to stop it. Active response is where it's going to let you know, but it's also going to try to drop the connection or do something. You could also run a script, as well, drop the IP. Those are the common responses. What are some of the disadvantages of an NIDS, for example? Well, again, if there's benefits, there's probably cons as well, right? So typically, let's say, for example, if there is an attack, right, sometimes the response, right, may take a little bit longer than what the folks monitoring everything may even be aware of. You get a lot of false positives too, right? Again, lots of challenges too. Sort of like if you're not careful with how you monitor and the alerts that you set up, I mean, it's sort of like, you get overwhelmed if you're monitoring too much. So very, very common for that to happen. Then we have what's called a UTM. That's a Unified Threat Management System. And again, basically, again, I'm assuming that you know what these terms are. If you don't, just make sure you do. But at a high level, a UTM is going to typically merge a firewall and an IDS. Typically, it's used more for intrusion detection or intrusion prevention. So again, there's plenty of vendors out there. Everyone from Palo Alto, Fortinet, Cisco, they all have their own approach to this. So basically, it's usually going to provide multiple functions. So on the exam, just know what a UTM is. And then again, if you have a valuable asset, a valuable host, right, it makes sense that you install some kind of intrusion detection system as well. Now, again, you may want to, like on a NAS file share to a database server, whatever, you really should use these judiciously as well, because again, you could have a lot of false positives, a lot of labor to do. So again, if it's, Joe Schmuckatelli's desktop server and, he's not doing too much other than developing programs, and maybe you don't need to have one on there. But again, you may want to have one on there as well. It's your call. Now, again, Windows and Linux, there's different types available. Some are free, some are not. You have to pick your battles wisely, as I like to say. And then when you configure IDS, just realize that there's different approaches to configuring IDSs. So again, an IDS is going to try to attempt to determine if there's like an intrusion, right? If there's some kind of behavior. So it's going to run this, analysis engine basically and try to pick up unusual traffic. That's really what it's doing. So how does it do it? The methods that typically could occur would be signature based. That's pretty common. So for example, it's more or less known, and you may want to write this down, it's typically known as pattern matching. So for example, if packets are in this pattern, then all of a sudden it changes, then that would pick up that the signature of this traffic changed. And then you have behavior-based. Now, behavior-based is similar to basically a profile. So, for example, if you have, let's say, a human resources administrator, he's going to log on to certain applications. But what about if he goes to like a file share that maybe he shouldn't be going to? Again, these are some things you want to look at. So behavior-based is known as baseline heuristics, and behavior-based is really similar to a profile-based. Could also be called statistical. A lot of the vendors have their own take on this, so I wouldn't say that there's one size fits all here. And then anomaly-based, again, fairly simple, right? Anomaly is what? This is where the behavior all of a sudden changes. So for example, if all of a sudden a SQL server, for example, is writing specific to specific log files or specific instances, or let's say redo logs or something, then all of a sudden it changes, or there's additional behavior that's picked up. That's an anomaly. So something that's out of the ordinary. So again, signature-based detection. When you compare the methods, these are the pros and cons, for example. On the exam, again, you're going to be expected to know the difference between signature-based and behavior-based. Now, a very common tool that you should be aware of, and if you're not, again, you may want to just do some research. This is an open source utility. It's called Snort, very common. Matter of fact, just about all, I would say, network folks probably are familiar with Snort, and especially if you're using Linux, very common to run it on Linux, but you could run it on Windows as well. But again, Snort is a common tool set. Generally with Snort, you could operate in two different approaches. They have, at least to this day, as far as I'm aware, it's sniffer or log only modes. So you typically would use it more for the ability to prevent attacks. So you could shut down like traffic that is coming in. So for example, you could do what's called a TCP reset. So a very common tool. Again, this is a good tool that's available. And then SourceFire Bro is another one as well that a lot of folks may be familiar with.